welcome to Cover Story. Today we are joined by James Crabtree. He's the Associate Professor in Practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. But more important for us, he's also the author of a book, a much talked about book, The Billionaire Raj. It's already being talked about in Delhi, Bombay and beyond. And of course, another thing about James is that he's been the India correspondent of Financial Times for 5 years in Bombay. And I assume that's when he met most of the people he talked about in this book. Welcome to NewsX, James. We've been trying to catch hold of you for a while now.
Thank you.
To begin with, James, I noticed in the book you've coined a very interesting phrase called the oligarchs, the polygarchs rather, you and Raghuram Rajan between you. Could you explain that to our viewers, what exactly you mean by this?
Well, so in Russia, the oligarchs were the heads of the largest businesses in the country. And so almost as a joke, some people have called India's biggest tycoons, people like Mukesh Ambani, Vijay Mallya, Gautam Adani, some of the people I talk about in my book, they call them boligarchs. It's partly a joke, but it partly has a serious point, which is over the last 10 or 15 years, these businessmen have become extraordinarily powerful and very controversial. And so the role that they play in Indian business is something that should concern people, not just in India, but also outside and around the world.
And a bit of Bollywood also, a flair, which we can see actually from the cover of your book, which has a much talked about house in Bombay, which I've noticed you chose this as the cover. Why did you choose the Antilla as the cover of the book?
Well, so Antilia is one of the most famous landmarks in India. People call it the billion-dollar house. Mr. Mukesh Ambani, the owner, is now the richest man in Asia. He has a fortune of $45 billion. And so that house stands for the extraordinary wealth that has been created in India over the last 10 or 15 years, but also the inequality that has come with it. And so in a sense, that house, more than anything, stands as an icon to the kind of country that India is becoming.
You use a very interesting phrase, which is there in your title also, a journey through India's new Gilded Age. I read in your book how the phrase Gilded Age came across. In fact, it was coined by Jayant Sinha and Ashutosh Vashni. Can you tell us a bit more about this phrase and also the inequality that you see that you talk about?
The phrase Gilded Age was coined actually by the American novelist Mark Twain in the second half of the 19th century. It described America after the end of its civil war in 1865 and onwards for the next 40 years. That was a period that in many ways is quite similar to the one India is going through now, one in which there were huge extremes of wealth, lots of corruption, rapid urbanization. And while the experience of America 100 years or more ago and India today are not the same, there are some parallels. And in a sense, this is a stage that India is moving through. But my book is called A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age, because that, I think, is what I saw when I lived in India for 5 years.
What I found fascinating is some of your encounters with these billionaires, especially Vijay Mallya. You write how you meet him in London at his home there, fancy house, fancy car parked in the driveway, all dressed up but really nowhere to go. Can you tell us a bit more about that meeting with Vijay Mallya and what you felt for him as that tycoon in exile, so to speak?
All dressed up and nowhere to go is actually a very good description of Mr. Mallya. I met him last summer. For an afternoon. I went to his very opulent house just next to Regent's Park in London, where, as all your viewers will know, he is stuck. He can't return to India. He can't go anywhere else. So he's stuck in London. And he told me all about the ups and the downs of his businesses. We had 4 hours together. He smoked a large number of cigarettes and drank a number of whiskeys and felt like he was needing to talk. I found him a persuasive and charismatic man. But also one who I think was feeling rather sorry for himself. He feels that he has been rather hard done by. He feels that many of the things that have happened to him are not his fault. A lot of people in India would disagree with that, but I suppose I still found that there was a lot of the old charisma and chutzpah of the Vijay Mallya that many of your viewers will have known from 5 or 10 years ago.
But he also talked about how difficult it is to weed out corruption in India from the system. I found that really ironic, considering it's Vijay Mallya who's speaking about all this.
Well, yes, he did have a firm view that India is an economy that has a deep-rooted corruption problem and that is going to be with the country for a long time. He didn't seem to have reflected deeply on the conflicts of interest within his own role, the fact that he was a politician and he was also a businessman, and many people have claimed that this is not perhaps the way that people should be allowed to behave. But nonetheless, I don't think he's entirely wrong about that. India does have quite a deep-rooted problem of corruption, and you have to think that this is going to be a 20, 30-year project in order to make this better. So in a sense, I didn't think he was wrong about that.
But there's also, you quoted Raghuram Rajan's advice to Vijay Mallya, which is, if you're in trouble, then at least show that you care and kind of cut down your lavish lifestyle. Isn't that one of the problems why Vijay Mallya has become the poster boy for corruption and flamboyance? Part of it is his own fault. Isn't that correct?
I think that's true about Mr. Mallya, that in a sense the reason why he has become what he calls the poster child for bad loans and problems of corruption is that he's still very talkative. But this is a much broader problem. I mean, my book, The Billionaire Raj, talks about the fact that this is a problem across the corporate sector in India. It's just that most of the rest of the people who have been involved in this have kept their heads down. And so a lot of the attention has gone to Mr. Mallya because he's so flamboyant. But it's not just a problem of Vijay Mallya. This is a problem that went all the way through the industrial backbone of India's economy.
Okay, before we go on to the larger problem, there's also a very interesting anecdote about Mukesh Ambani. I mean, you were there at the when the Jio launch happened. How do you read that launch? I mean, it's not really a public-spirited exercise for national digital development, as you said. It could almost be read as that, but it's not quite that.
So I wasn't actually at the launch of Jio. I watched it on YouTube, but I was watching Jio very carefully. I think Mr. Ambani deserves some credit, which is he spent an enormous amount of money, $35 billion on this service, and a lot of people in India have got cheap mobile phones with very fast internet access because of that. So it's been very beneficial to consumers. The problem I suppose I have with Mr. Ambani is that his business affairs are run in a way that are quite opaque. It's often difficult to get a handle on what a company like Reliance is doing, he's a very competitive operator. But certainly his competitors often claim that in a sense he's excessively competitive. And so when I said that in the book about an almost public-spirited, that's how he wanted it to be seen, that this was an exercise in national development. But clearly he's a very competitive, ferociously competitive entrepreneur, and so you shouldn't take entirely at face value what he says about why he's launching this business.
And as you yourself said, the old joke that India went from self-reliance to reliance. That was the story of post when the opening up of the economy. A little bit about the Indian economy from the liberalization days to now, to where we are now, if you can help us trace it a bit.
I think people often start the story of India, in the modern India in 1991, which makes sense. But the story I wanted to tell really began in the middle of the 2000s. The first 15 years after liberalization, the changes were relatively slow and in only a few sectors. It was really in the mid-2000s that the boom years started across the economy. That this is when the investment boom happened. It's when the bad debt started to be taken. It's also when the billionaires and the super rich really began to take off in earnest. And so in a sense, I think that it's been a story that went from 2004 to 2014. And then after that, after Modi has been elected, we've been trying to grapple with the after effects of that enormous period of globalization and growth. And I think that's the story of the Indian economy that's most interesting, and that's the one that's in the book.
So do we look at our oligarchs as unscrupulous villains or heroes of capitalism? Because, you also said that they do play a role in building infrastructure, and you've compared India with the China story also.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think a lot of people in this country quite rightly admire people like Mr. Ambani or Mr. Adani. They're seen to be entrepreneurs, people who've made something of themselves. Although Mr. Ambani inherited his money, nonetheless his family was not a rich family until his father made his money. Mr. Adani's family were not rich. And so there's something impressive about what these people, men normally, unfortunately, have been able to do. Nonetheless, I think there is a skepticism about the Indian industrial tycoons in general, that they are playing entirely by the rules and that they are not using their political connections to fix the market a little bit in their own favor. And so I think in the end, India needs to move from a situation in which it is an economy based on discretion, in which some people are able to fix the rules in their own advantage, to one in which everyone plays by the same rules, and in which the market is decided by competition, and that's where you're trying to get to.
Well, we need to take a short break, but stay with us because we're going to come back and continue this conversation with James. Hello and welcome back to Cover Story. We are in conversation with James Crabtree, the author of The Billionaire Raj, a book that is being much talked about in Delhi, Bombay and beyond. Come to Prime Minister Modi. You've been very critical of demonetization, but you feel that he's putting in some kind of systems in place, because we are again at a curve where, we went from boom to bust to he's trying to revive the economy, or are his measures helping, or you think they're not helping?
Well, I think demonetization was a very bad policy, one of the worst that has been introduced by any government in recent memory. It was very destructive. It had a few positive benefits, but not very many. Putting that to one side, I don't think Mr. Modi's record has been all that bad. But I think the challenge for India is that the amount of reform that is needed to meet the aspirations of the Indian people to move very quickly from being a poor country to being a middle-income country to being in the middle of this century to being a rich one requires very dramatic changes. Not simply in areas like infrastructure, but things that educate the population, that build a health service, that give people pensions. And I think on a number of those areas, the more radical and controversial reforms, Mr. Modi either hasn't wanted or hasn't been able to deliver quite to the extent that people had hoped.
Which is true. You're saying that he's not using his political capital as much as he could have. In terms of reforms, is he going more the populist way? He's again gone back to the Congress way of giving out doles and freebies rather than, bring in big ticket reforms. Would you agree with that?
I think Mr. Modi has introduced some big ticket reforms, but probably not enough. And the risk is that, in a sense, people are waiting for the next election. Now we're in a cycle where the election has already begun. We're all looking forward to next May. And so this sense is that, well, okay, we can't do anything now, but after the election, then maybe we will have these reforms. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think that, in a sense, if Mr. Modi has governed so far as a moderately cautious economic reformer, then that in a sense is what's probably going to happen were he to return as Prime Minister. And so I think that that is a challenge, that in the end there are problems that India needs to fix very badly. It needs to fix the bad loans in the banking system. It needs to make it easier to build big factories that can export. And all of these things aren't going to happen by accident. They do need substantial political reforms, and I think India needs to move faster in that direction.
Are you familiar with the bankruptcy code bill that he's trying to bring in, trying to prevent people like Vijay Mallya and other people walking off with bad debts? Because you said that India's banks hold about, I think, 150 billion worth of their assets and bad debts.
So I think there are two problems that have been the after effects of the boom that happened that I discuss in The Billionaire Raj. One of which is bad corporate debt, and the other of which is bad bank debt. On the first, Mr. Modi's record with the bankruptcy court is not bad. I think they're beginning to grapple with this. Between Delhi and the RBI in Mumbai, progress is being made, and that is to be welcomed. But the really big problem is the banking system. In the end, we still have something like 18% of assets in the banking system are non-performing. And we're really almost no closer to fixing that problem today than we were when Mr. Modi took office. And until you fix what ails the banking system, nothing else is going to work properly.
You also quote a conversation with Jayant Sinha where he very euphemistically calls Prime Minister Modi is doing for India what Teddy Roosevelt did for America, moving it from the Gilded Age to the progressive age. Would you agree with that?
So I understand why Mr. Sinha is making that comparison. I think it's generous to Mr. Modi to compare him to Theodore Roosevelt, certainly on the basis of his record so far. But I would agree with Mr. Sinha to this respect, that is the kind of thing that India needs. it needs a robust reforming leader who is going to be fearless in the face of corporate power and who is going to push through really far-reaching reforms to the way that the state sector works, to the way that the natural resources sector works, to make it easier to build the kind of factories that will turn India into an exporting hub. And so that does need to be the aspiration. I'm not convinced that Mr. Modi has quite got there yet, but reasonable people can disagree on this.
But you also talk about him wasting his political capital, and in the context of the UP elections, I was very interested to read that his choice of Yogi Adityanath as chief minister. But if not Yogi, then who should he have made? Should he have made someone who would give a better kind of message? What exactly did you mean by that?
I was very disappointed by the decision to appoint Yogi Adityanath, and I thought that this was one of those moments where Mr. Modi really had an opportunity to signal that he was a different kind of political leader. He could have picked any number of impressive, reform-minded technocrats who would have worked out how to fix the deep-rooted problems in a state like Uttar Pradesh, and instead he went for a political figure who, the best one can say of him is that he is popular in his state, but he's clearly very divisive. He has no particular record as an economic reformer. He comes from a part of the state that has terrible social and economic outcomes. And in a sense, by picking Yogi Adityanath, he sacrificed the economic future of that state for the BJP's political popularity. And I think that along with demonetization, his decision to pick Yogi Adityanath and not another kind of leader will go down as a black mark for Mr. Modi's name.
But a lot of people compare Yogi with the Prime Minister himself. They have an early political posturing or whatever. They're trying to define a sort of an image that got them so far. But the minute they come into government, they do try and redefine themselves. We had the Gujarat model, and Yogi is now perhaps working towards a UP model. He is being tough on law and order. You can question his encounter policies. But I'm speaking to a lot of people in UP. They are saying the electricity has improved. The law and order situation has become much better than it was during the Samajwadi Party days. So maybe he is following the Modi trajectory.
I mean, you can make that kind of argument, but I don't find that a very impressive argument. In the end, India has lots of very impressive people who know how to turn around an economy that is not performing, and Yogi Adityanath had very little in his resume to suggest that he was that kind of person. Now, we wish him well. He has 200 million people to look after, and I hope that he does indeed manage to develop a new kind of economic model for that part of the country, and one that is as successful as Gujarat was. But I think Mr. Modi in that appointment had an opportunity really to demonstrate that he was the kind of Prime Minister he said that he was, that someone who was concerned fundamentally about economic development, about jobs, about promoting manufacturing. And if those were your priorities, then Yogi Adityanath was a very curious choice.
So Yogi is another fact. You end your book with the tragedy of being Narendra Modi, or tragedy of us having to choose. In fact, a little bit more about the tragedy of Modi.
Well, I suppose I call the chapter The Tragedy of Modi for exactly that reason, which is that I take Mr. Modi at his word that he wanted to be and wants to be an economic reformer. I think that he deeply believes in the importance of building infrastructure. I think he is frustrated by India's position, and he looks at other countries, particularly those in East Asia, that have moved quickly from poverty to middle income and rich status, and he wants that for India. But unfortunately, he hasn't quite been able to move as quickly in that direction. Partly, I think, because he's anxious about the political costs of introducing some of these reforms and becoming unpopular, and partly because there are people within his own party who do not quite share his vision of what economic reform looks like. And in a sense, he therefore has to try and keep his political coalition together. And so he hasn't been able to move as quickly as perhaps even he would have liked. I mean, I don't know exactly what's in his mind, but certainly he hasn't been able to deliver entirely on the promise that he was elected on.
And this narrative of hyper-nationalism that we are seeing in the face of, say, the rise of Hindu assertiveness, do you think that's all part of the political narrative for the Prime Minister and the BJP to get another term? Is that the reason why they are sticking to this agenda, and maybe next elections, if they come back, they'll focus on actually the business of governance?
I mean, I think there are some people who believe that Mr. Modi, were he to win power, will return to office and deliver the reforms that he did not deliver in his first term. I find that to be quite unlikely. For starters, were he to return as Prime Minister, it's very difficult to imagine him doing so with a greater or the same majority. So almost certainly he will be in a weaker position politically. And therefore, given the fact that he will be a slightly weaker Prime Minister in Parliament, it's hard then to imagine that he's suddenly going to become a risk-taking daredevil Prime Minister. It's one of the oddities about demonetization that was a very, very brave thing to do. And one of the tragedies of his Prime Ministership is that he decided to be brave with precisely the wrong policy and then not to be brave with many of the right policies.
In fact, you quote Gurcharan Das in the end, who says that I see the risk of voting for Modi much less than the risk of not voting for Modi. He said that in the context of 2014. Do you see the same risk being repeated in 2019 also? There are really no alternatives to Prime Minister Modi.
Well, people must make their own decisions about that. I think you're talking about Gurcharan Das, the author and intellectual, and so Mr. Das voted for Modi in 2014, and he decided that this was a risk worth taking. He was worried about the nationalist communal baggage that came partly with Mr. Modi's heritage and partly with the more extreme elements of the BJP. But he was very frustrated with the performance of the economy under the Congress. And I think a lot of people will continue to think that is a bargain worth taking. Mr. Modi remains a very popular politician. The best polling data suggests that 80% of people in India think he's doing a basically good job. So while people in the media are often quite critical of him, out there in the country the evidence suggests that people think Mr. Modi's actually doing quite a good job, and so I would expect that a lot of people would vote in that way.
In your book, you talk a lot, you met a whole lot of politicians, but there is more of Modi, but not that much of Rahul Gandhi. Why is that? Is it because at that point he wasn't important, or you don't see him as a key player in India's future also?
I mean, I don't discount the idea of a Rahul renaissance. I think that if he could pull his act together a bit, he has the family name, he's articulate, he's very handsome. But as you say, when I was writing my book, it was a period in which the Congress was really at its lowest point. It was reduced in the last election to a rump of 40 seats. And so it was really beginning this process of grappling with the disaster of 2014. And so Rahul Gandhi simply wasn't around very much in the period that I was talking about. Now, we'll just have to see how he performs in the next election in order to wonder whether it might be that some kind of comeback is possible. But at the moment, that road looks very long and very hard to get from where they are now to where they need to be.
But there has been a Rahul makeover in the last 6 months. Ever since he took over as party president, he's become more assertive, engaging people, even hugging people a whole lot more. Did you notice the hug that he gave the Prime Minister?
Well, I think the speech that Mr. Gandhi gave in Parliament a little while ago for the no confidence motion was one of the best that he has given. And it gets back to the themes of my book, The Billionaire Raj, which talks a lot about crony capitalism. And I think corruption remains one of the central issues in Indian politics, if not the central issue. And I understand why it is a subject that Mr. Gandhi has decided to focus on. I think it's one of the best subjects that he could focus on. And to the extent that he is able to articulate a clear message on corruption, then I think he will do better than he has done. The problem is an obvious one, which is that it's not clear that people are yet ready to forgive his own party for the corruption that occurred on their watch.
Well, we hope Mr. Gandhi also reads your book, as we all are reading it right now. Thank you so much, James, for talking to us, and it's really been a wonderful book that I've enjoyed reading. But thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Well, that's it from us this week. Thank you for watching this show. We'll see you again same time next week.